Hi there. My name is Tamara Mahoney, and this is the Open Energy Access podcast from the EnAccess Foundation. This is the show where we focus on what's happening in the energy access sector. We talk development, innovation, and open source ideas. Today we're trying something new by putting up the podcast that I recorded on YouTube. We're putting the full video out on YouTube, which is mostly completely unedited. Of course, if you'd prefer to listen to the podcast and hear the nice edited version where nobody says or like, you can search for Open Energy Access in your podcast players. If you want to see the nice unedited version, we've got the full video for you right here. So I started this podcast to share the very real, practical, and useful lessons from the real people within our sector, and just to talk about what people in energy access are working on these days. In the conversation that I had earlier, I talked to Paul Needham and Ricky Buch from Positive Capital Partners. Now, EnAccess is one of the funders of a project that they are working on together with South Pole called the DREC initiative. To introduce the DREC initiative, first, let's talk renewable energy. There is already a large market for renewable energy, and it's the corporations and the utility companies that are the main buyers of renewable energy in a developed market, like in the United States. But what doesn't yet exist is a way for those corporations or those large companies to invest in distributed renewable energy. And the Distributed Renewable Energy Certificate, or the DREC, is a solution for that problem. If there was a way to certify and value the energy being produced by, let's say, a mini-grid company operating in an off-grid environment, we might see a lot more investment coming into energy access. And so this is what we discussed in the conversation that I had with Paul and Ricky. And this topic is really useful for absolutely everybody who is currently working in energy access to understand. I would also invite climate investors and corporate sustainability leaders to hear how they can also benefit from the DREC initiative. Now, the EnAccess Foundation, which is where I work, is not the only funder behind this project. We are very happy to be joined by the Shell Foundation, the Good Energies Foundation, the Signify Foundation, the German Corporation for International Cooperation, the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the UNDP, the IFC, and the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. So we covered a lot during our conversation, and I'm going to go get into that right now. Of course, I started by just simply asking Ricky and Paul to introduce themselves and to tell us a little bit about their background and how they ended up working together on the DREC initiative.
Well, Tamara, thanks so much for having us on the podcast today. So I'm Paul Needham. I've been working in the off-grid energy space for maybe 10 or 12 years. I co-founded a company in India called Simpa Networks, which was one of the world's first pay-as-you-go solar companies. Lived in India for 5 years, helped build that company, and we sold that to NG, one of really important actor in the off-grid distributed renewable energy space. And since then, I've continued to work, and I've really zeroed in on this problem of mobilizing finance into the acceleration of the energy transition in emerging markets. Prior to co-founding Simpa Networks, I was at Microsoft, and prior to that, I had an internet advertising company, a tech platform that we built and sold. My academic background is in development economics, so I've long been interested in the problems of accelerating economic development in developing and emerging markets. So yeah, Ricky and I, together with our colleague Nick Fedorkiw, have formed Positive Capital Partners, and we are one organization that is co-leading the DREC initiative. We're co-leading it together with South Pole Carbon Asset Management Group. And looking forward to telling you more about what we're working on and the problems we're trying to solve here. I'll hand it over to Ricky.
Hey, Ricky. Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about, where you come from, how you met Paul, and what you're working on now.
my name is Ricky Buch. I grew up just outside San Francisco. My academic background is actually in computer engineering. So just out of college, I worked at Microsoft for a few years, decided I wanted to change, and so I went to grad school. And that's actually when I was first exposed to the energy access sector. I was actually working on a grad school project that was looking at maternal health outcomes in emerging markets, specifically Bangladesh, India, and Tanzania. And so I was with a group of students, and we traveled to remote clinics to essentially see how effective outreach programs were in reaching these marginalized communities. And the biggest problem we actually saw was a lack of power. That women would travel for kilometers, days even, to these public health facilities to receive an ultrasound scan, and they would unfortunately have to wait days more because there simply was no power for the machines. That was my first exposure really to this issue around energy poverty. And after that, I worked at General Electric for many years. My last role at GE was actually helping lead a small team that was focused on the energy access space. We developed solar hybrid microgrids, essentially power plants in a box, that we deployed at a variety of off-grid sites. Unfortunately, GE decided to go a slightly different direction, and so I changed paths, did a bit of consulting for SMAP, and specifically the Global Facility for Mini-Grids. And it was then that I actually reconnected with Paul, who I think during my time at GE, I was trying to just learn from industry experts on what worked well in the energy access space, as I was trying to convince GE's management that this was a problem that needed to be tackled. And so I reached out to Paul, and Paul was gracious with his time, and we chatted and stayed in touch. And then after I had left GE and wanted to continue to work in the energy access space, he and I reconnected. And then we brought in our third colleague, Nick. And that's really where Positive Capital was formed, in sort of a shared mission and objective in addressing this problem.
Was it the idea came first, right, for the DREC initiative? And then Positive Capital Partners was formed as a result of that idea? Or how did that originate?
Well, it's often hard to trace where ideas come from. I think each of us were coming at the problem from different perspectives. When I was at Simpa, we had invented a pay-as-you-go solar panel where IoT technology was integrated into the back of the solar panel, and we could remotely turn on and off the panel and monitor the energy generation. And at the time I was thinking, we've developed this fancy technology to enable finance. So we could offer solar equipment on finance or on a pay-as-you-go basis to customers, but we're also collecting this really valuable data about how much energy is being generated, and who might value that data. And when Ricky and I started talking, we realized, actually corporates might value that data. And Nick Fedorkio as well had been working in sort of big wind industry. And we started talking about corporate power purchase agreements and these new corporate sustainability targets. And as you've been tracking this, I mean, the momentum behind this movement is really growing. There are now 350 companies that have committed to power their business with 100% renewable electricity. So we saw this massive and growing demand from the private sector for renewable energy and for renewable energy attributes. They want to be involved in building and deploying new renewables. And on the other hand, you've got the off-grid energy space that is selling electrons and energy services to low-income people in low-resource communities. But that whole sector has been unable to effectively monetize the environmental attributes. So, we thought, okay, how do we connect these two? How do we help corporates and the private sector achieve their climate targets, but also help DRE project developers monetize the good work that they're doing, monetize the environmental attributes that those projects are generating? Yeah, so we came together thinking, okay, what's lacking here is some kind of market instrument that connects these two. And our first thought was, okay, as a private company, we could solve that problem. But it only took a handful of conversations with corporates to discover that, no, what's needed is a global standard. Any one company can't solve this. This isn't something that one party could create because it wouldn't be adopted. The buyers of of renewable energy attributes, just like the buyers of carbon credits, they need to work under an internationally accepted standard. So we realized that, okay, we need to create a market. We're not just trying to build a business here. We're trying to create a market. And there are a few things that are needed. There's an instrument, there's a technology platform, there's a lot of market development work that needs to happen. So we were speaking with the Shell Foundation, and they had been thinking a lot about this problem as well. And they introduced us to South Pole, who had done a similar project around carbon. And yeah, so the parties came together and we started to think, okay, how could we actually mobilize the whole sector and create something that's open source, that's available for all to use, that many different companies could take advantage of, and could live well beyond the ambitions of, and be much bigger than the ambitions of any one company. And that was really the spark for the idea of the DREC initiative.
No small task, huh? Like just create a new global standard.
Sounds, right. Yeah.
It sounds easy. Why don't you, I'm not sure which one of you wants to take this question. Tell me how one gets started creating a new global standard for something like this, because it's so big that it's really hard to get your mind around it.
Yeah, it is big. And the first step was to involve multiple people from different organizations and types of stakeholders in some kind of consultation process, just to figure out what the boundaries are of a project like this. What's in scope, what's out of scope, what needs to be managed through a multi-stakeholder process, and which pieces could certain organizations take. That helped us kind of define the problem in terms of various work streams. Okay. So we settled in on 5 major work streams, and we've identified key stakeholders in each work stream. So that the major work streams are, if I can get these right now, there is a kind of a market development work stream that's really around advocacy, working with potential buyers, so corporates, climate investors. Mm-hmm. There's a work stream around the standards organizations. We don't really want to create an entirely new standard that's disconnected from existing standards. We want to create an on-ramp to existing standards. So small DRE projects can easily get IREC certification, for example. So there's a work stream around standards and engaging with the different international standards organizations like IREC, Gold Standard, Vera, and others. The third work stream is really around the technology. What sort of open source technology platform do we need to lower the transaction costs for multiple small projects to get their energy generation data certified and verified in some sort of semi-automated way? The next work stream is really around finance. How could an instrument like this mobilize new finance? How could it help not just generate a new revenue stream for project developers, but help them go to the bank and say, can I borrow to build this project because I've got this guaranteed revenue stream from the sale? So there's all that financing innovation. And on that one, by the way, we're partnering with the IFC and engaging with multiple other investors. Then the fifth, if I've counted correctly, the fifth work stream is really around piloting and putting all that into practice. And we've got 3 different kinds of pilot projects that we're doing. And Ricky, if you're back with us, why don't I hand it to you to talk about the different kinds of pilots that we're doing?
Thanks, Paul. So we've decided to build our pilot strategy around proving a couple different concepts. The first is really a technical proof of concept, which is as we build out the DREC platform, which is really focused around automating how we issue certificates against generation data. Our goal there is to really show how we can automate the process of collecting information from a variety of different DRE assets, including solar home systems and mini grids, process that information in near real time, and then issue certificates against the data that we've collected. And so that's really our first goal with the POC, is to show that we can do this, 1, in a scalable fashion, 2, how we can collect information from disparate devices scattered across the globe, and to do it in a streamlined and transparent way. The next pilot we have really builds on top of that, but focuses on a particular application. So we have the great opportunity to work with the UN Development Program, and specifically the Climate Aggregation Platform team there that is focused on electrifying health facilities in Africa. And clearly, they have been able to amass a series of funds that are used to pay for the CapEx part of the program. But there is a need for ongoing operations and maintenance and to support those systems on an ongoing basis. And that's really where they look to the DREC initiative to come in and offer a solution. And that's where we're looking to partner with them and figure out, can we monetize the DRECs from these health facilities and find a corporate off-taker and use those funds to help support ongoing OpEx costs. And so that will really extend the technical platform from the proof of concept into this particular application where we're collecting a lot of rich data from a specific off-taker, ensuring that we're able to collect data from fairly remote regions and provide enough transparency for a corporate buyer to be comfortable in providing funds for the DRECs. And then the last pilot, again, sort of builds collectively on both of those two prior ones, what we're calling the commercial pilot, which is really around catalyzing new funds for projects to go in the ground. So the proof of concept was really around collecting data from operational systems. The next one was really around using the DRECs to offset the OpEx costs. And the last pilot is really around mobilizing new capital, put new projects in the ground, and then generate DRECs from that and find corporate off-takers for that. So it's really a progression that we see, and I think really speaks to potentially how flexible the DREC instrument can be in mobilizing new sources of capital for project development.
Now, let me think. It's kind of on the topic of pilots, but when I talk about the DREC initiative to people kind of in my more immediate world, I talk a lot with SHS companies, with mini grid companies, with energy access practitioners who want to know how they can be involved. And when I hear how can I be involved, I'm kind of hearing, well, how can I benefit from this? This sounds great. What's the answer for these energy access practitioners?
Yeah, well, having worked in the space for a decade, I know that there are many challenges to mobilizing finance.
Mm-hmm.
If you're building a mini grid or you want to expand your solar home system business into new areas and expand, these companies are offering energy services to consumers or small businesses. But the companies themselves need to invest in the equipment up front. And that's a challenge, mobilizing the finance to do that. So, there are these practical challenges in mobilizing the upfront capital. Often these companies need to borrow money from abroad, from overseas in hard currency, and yet their customers are paying them in local currency. So they're exposed to this foreign exchange risk. There's also the problem of, for an investor, how do they aggregate each of these projects can be quite small. So how do they aggregate a large number of small projects? And this DREC initiative is aiming to solve many of these problems. So for a specific project developer, what could this instrument do for them? Well, number one, it could help bring them a new revenue stream, in short. So not only are you selling electricity to consumers and small businesses in the villages where you're operating, you're now able to sell, you will soon be able to sell your environmental attributes, your DRECs, into a global market, which could be, Fortune 500 companies that are trying to meet their net zero targets, and they need to invest in more renewable energy projects in order to reduce their scope 2 emissions, or through their supply chain partners, reduce their scope 3 emissions. So number one, new revenue stream. Don't just sell electrons, sell and get paid for the environmental good that you're doing as well by selling the environmental attributes. Second is that new revenue stream comes in a hard currency. It doesn't matter what happens with the exchange rate between your local currency and the US dollar. The DRECs will be priced in and paid for in a hard currency, euros or US dollars, for example. That really helps de-risk the projects that you're doing from the perspective of your investors who may be investing in hard currencies alongside that. Also, we expect that this instrument will allow companies to come up that will agree in advance to purchase all of the DRECs from your project even before you build it. And with that contract in hand, that will help you go to a bank and say, yeah, I have two revenue streams. My customers will pay for electricity, and I've pre-sold the DRECs for the next 5 years. And I've pre-sold them to this global company, so it's a credible offtake agreement. So you might be able to borrow against that agreement, against that offtake agreement from an international buyer. That might help you mobilize finance locally to get your project built. And these, of course, are ideas at the moment because we haven't got it all up yet. But these mechanisms that I describe are already at work in the REC markets in North America and in Europe today. So we're not really trying to create anything completely new here. We're trying to build on a market instrument that is already working really well in Europe and in the US, and extend that and make it more appropriate so that project developers that are building DRE projects are able to also take advantage of this really powerful instrument.
How are you working on making some kind of standard in how we measure these electrons that are getting sold? Because I would imagine that would be among the challenges. Where do you start doing that, or where is that in this process?
Maybe I'll answer that by starting with just a brief description on how the environmental markets today go about doing that.
Yeah.
So let's take, for example, the International REC standard, with whom we are working closely and seeking to extend the IREC into the DRA space more comprehensively. So they have a stakeholder which they term the issuer. And so prior to an IREC being issued, the issuer, which is a country designated authority, essentially reviews generation evidence and says, I think this particular plant produced X number of megawatt hours. And since one IREC corresponds to a single megawatt hour, they will say, I will therefore issue this many IRECs. And so there's this third party arbitration authority, essentially, that will has the jurisdiction to say how many IRECs are produced from a particular plant. The challenge we're facing is how do we scale that model down when we're talking about potentially thousands of devices, hundreds of, if not thousands of developers. It simply isn't a model that is scalable, because then the bottleneck becomes the issuer, and they simply don't have the resources really to be able to validate data from all these projects. And that's really, I think, where we've decided to turn to the broader community and crowdsource the solution. And to do so in partnership with the Energy Web Foundation, with whom we've partnered on the technical front. So the idea is the Energy Web Foundation they came out of the Rocky Mountain Institute, and they have been focused on deploying new technologies in the energy space to really drive decarbonization, among them being a blockchain. So they have developed something called the Energy Web Chain, which is a distributed ledger, which can be used for a variety of different applications, one of which happens to be environmental attribute tracking. So there is an open source module called Origin, which they've developed, which has already been deployed in a few different countries, where they are able to collect data from different devices and work with the IREC issuer in those countries and essentially issue IRECs in a more automated fashion than existed previously. And our goal is to then further enhance that and add a much stronger component around the automated verification. And so that's not just the generation data coming so that we can issue DRECs. It's really trying to understand the projects and where they're installed and how big they are, and some of the other parameters that we need in order to communicate that information to DREC buyers. And again, I think that's really where we lean on the wider community to work with the DREC initiative, to work with us to really define what that looks like. Because ultimately, our goal is to make this standard as widely adopted as possible. And that means that people need to have trust in how the system verifies project data from a registration standpoint and from an actual issuance perspective. And so, our goal is to really work closely hand in hand with developers, financiers, corporate off-takers, a variety of different stakeholders to really develop collectively what that algorithm looks like, building off of what's already there with the Origin module and the Energy Web Foundation.
So my understanding is that you are not exactly starting from scratch. You're taking something that the Energy Web Foundation has created, and you're kind of using it for this project and building on top of it. And you were just mentioning that you want to make sure that others can continue to build. What part of the DREC initiative is open source, in your opinion? Is it the whole concept? Is it the technology? Is it one piece, or is it the other piece? What do you want to leave the community with to continue to build upon?
I would say at a high level, it really is the whole concept. It is the idea of what the instrument is, how it is governed, and then how it is implemented technically in the DREC platform. So let's take, for example, the first element of that, which is the governance rules. A lot of what we're doing is, as Paul's mentioned earlier, we're not inventing a new wheel here. We're simply extending what's already there and allowing for a wider variety of actors to participate in these markets. And so that is extending these existing environmental standards into the DRE space. So the way we're doing that is by essentially working closely with an already published source, again, sort of opening the doors to feedback from a variety of different stakeholders, and ensuring that whatever we develop in terms of governing rules and how the DRECs are created and tracked and certified will essentially have input from all of the stakeholders who are impacted by these rules. So the last thing we want is, as the DREC initiative, to be a closed door effort that simply publishes a rule saying, thou shalt do this. What we want is a much more bottoms up collective effort. And once those rules are published, then I think it will be self-governing in the sense that if someone needs a change because a new device is there or a new application or new data needs to be collected, then it is the right of every stakeholder to essentially bring that up and collectively decide how those rules should be adjusted. One of the longer term aspects we're looking at is, should there be a governing body for the DREC code, much as there are for other standards. But even with that, I think the idea is to ensure that that code that is published, is one accessible to everyone, and everyone that is impacted has a chance to ensure that it works for them. Now moving to the second aspect of that, which is a technical platform. As I mentioned, the origin module, which the Energy Web Foundation has developed for environmental attribute tracking, is open source. So it is published on GitHub. Folks can go and see what the code looks like. Since we're simply building on that, I would say the DREC initiative will essentially build a platform that will also be published on a repository like GitHub, be accessible to everyone. And for us, the benefit of that is that it drives that trust in what is being done. Because we're relying to a high degree on automation, it's important that people understand how the system is performing, the checks that it's providing, and if there are folks who have a better idea of how to make a better widget, and to allow the platform to do a more robust verification, or to ensure that it allows for a wider variety of devices to participate, then we want that door open. And so we want the community to continue to be involved in ensuring that the platform evolves as the space evolves, as we continue to make progress on SDG 7 and SDG 13, and as we continue to see progress in developers being able to commission more projects to ensure that the platform remains relevant. And so I think the way we do that is by ensuring that everything we do is open door, is easily accessible to all stakeholders, to ensure that there is a forum by which they can bring issues forward, to ensure that it works for them. And I think that in addition to just providing the trust and the verification to the wider ecosystem, I think it just ensures that the DREC platform will continue to remain relevant as the sector evolves.
I think that's a really good point that you made about the fact that the open source aspect of it does invoke trust in people. It's maybe not something that we think about right away when we think about why you would want to open source something, or honestly, what could make it worse if it wasn't open source. And I think this is a really, really, really good point that you're bringing up, because when there's nothing to hide, then you don't have to worry about the lack of trust issue, or who's in charge of what, or if there's a way of making it better, it's just out there for anyone to be involved in. Where things are right now in the DREC initiative, do you want to give me your idea of what this could look like in 1 year, in 5 years, in 10 years. What is the challenge that you're facing now? Ricky, I can start with you and then I can go over to Paul.
The largest issue that we're addressing right now is really how we can best engage corporate buyers. Because right now we are unfortunately working within the confines of pre-established rules around greenhouse gas accounting, and particularly with what we call Scope 2 emissions. So these are emissions that arise from a corporation's activities, from electricity that a corporate uses in a particular region. And the reason that we've seen a lot of activity around RECs and GOs and other similar instruments in the US and in Europe is because most of these corporations that have established climate goals around renewable energy usage or carbon emissions happen to have their domiciles in the US or in Europe. And most of their emissions arise from activities in those regions. Mm-hmm. And so thus far, the idea of extending the greenhouse gas rules and using instruments that will help address emissions in Africa or Asia, in particular South or Southeast Asia, hasn't really come up because corporates don't have a huge footprint. And so really for us, I think the idea is ensuring that companies that do have a footprint can use the DREC to offset those emissions, and two, to really tie the story of why corporates should care about these regions, even though they may not have an immediate operation or Scope 2 interest that they have to address in these countries. And it really comes down to climate is a global story, but the greenhouse gas rules are set up as if climate is a local story. And so companies are incentivized to look at emissions within a particular parameter. In this case, it happens to be within a regional boundary, like a country. Even though we acknowledge that as carbon emissions continue to increase in parts of Africa and Asia, that has a direct effect on the climate in where these countries or these companies are operating. And so I think really our goal is to reframe the DREC conversation not as a simple Scope 2 metric, but to engage corporates with this larger narrative around why it's important that when they're looking at investing in climate solutions, that they should look at emerging markets, even though that direct operational interest may not be there, as per the existing GHG rules.
One thing that I wanted to follow up on, you mentioned the word offset, and how is, when you're explaining this concept to, let's say, a new corporate, you're like, this would be able to help you offset your footprint. Is that a fair comparison? Is a DREC like a carbon offset? Is this in the same sentence? Is it in a different planet? What's the reaction that you get when, I'm not sure if I'm the first person to ask this question. My guess would be no.
You are not. It is unfortunately what has become a nuance, a field. Yeah. As more interest comes around corporate climate goals, there seems to be a proliferation of avenues and interest and ways in which companies can address their claims. But fundamentally, a REC is a measurement of a unit of electricity produced by a renewable plant. And an offset corresponds to avoided emissions. So while inherently there are potentially avoided emissions in putting a renewable plant in the ground, because you are not building a new coal plant or running an existing coal plant more, you're servicing that demand with a new renewable system. It is not the same as looking at planting a tree and what the carbon offset from that would be. And so part of the benefit of a REC is that it is easy to measure. If a kilowatt hour or megawatt hour is produced. With a carbon offset, which measures avoided emissions, it's harder to measure that because you have to see what it would have been if you had not done this particular activity and now what it is. And proving that what it would have been is a lot more challenging. And so our perspective is that a REC is easier to think about because you can see the outcome. Okay. You know whether it was produced or not because the electricity was generated and delivered. Whereas with a carbon offset, it's a little trickier because you have to prove the counterfactual.
That's a really good explanation. Thank you for that, because that's not a question that I've been able to easily answer when it comes up in different conversations. I'm really glad that people got the chance to hear you answer to that. Paul, why don't I throw it over to you and ask you, what is the hardest part of making this happen? Or if you don't want to talk about the hardest part, what do you think the most important thing that you're working on right now is? Sometimes those are the same things, but I'll leave it to you to distinguish.
Well, I think what's been very rewarding and the opportunity is in our conversations with corporates, we're seeing this incredible and growing climate ambition where so many companies are making net zero pledges or signing up to Science-Based Targets Initiative or signing up to RE100. And they're making these very ambitious commitments and sometimes even stepping them forward, saying, we're not going to try to get there by 2050. We want to get there by 2040 or 2030. So it's really exciting to see that ambition and to see that this openness to explore new tools, like how can they move faster? You know, the first thing every company does is do whatever they can to reduce their emissions before they start looking at offsets. And one of the ways they can reduce their emissions is by powering their business with renewable electricity. So that's been huge. Last year, 24 gigawatts of new renewables were contracted just by corporates trying to meet their targets. I mean, to put that in perspective, right now across, the IFC has done a study looking at 167 developing countries and found 20 to 30 million diesel generators are in operation right now. These very small scale diesel gen sets, they're generating about, so that's about 350 gigawatts of installed power. Each, you know, each device not much bigger than your desk, 350 gigawatts of power. And those devices, those diesel gen sets are burning dirty fuels, and they're spewing out about 100 megatons of CO2 equivalent per year. So if those things have like a 10-year life, that's a gigaton CO2 problem right there. Just replacing diesel gen sets and ridding our planet of those. And that, I think, is something that, you know, matches very nicely to corporate ambitions and the private sector ambitions. So what's become quite clear to us through multiple conversations with corporates is they are investing in renewables. They are looking for the greatest climate impact that they can have, you know, per dollar invested. And they're realizing that, look, the climate impact of any new renewables actually depends on what you're displacing, right? If you add more solar to the California grid, that's going to have a certain climate impact depending on, you know, how much dirty electricity you're displacing. So it turns out that if you add more renewables to the US grid, on average, you're displacing about 402 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So that's pretty good. If you're adding more renewables in Europe, you actually have less climate impact because the grid is already greener. So you're only displacing 255 grams of CO2 per kilowatt. So, you know, if you're choosing where should we invest in renewables, you should invest in renewables in the US because you're going to have a bigger impact. Well, it turns out that you can have a much bigger impact by deploying new renewables in Africa because, well, in Southern Africa, for example, where most of the grids are coal-fired, you're going to displace 950 grams of CO2, like double or triple what you're going to get out of the US or Europe in terms of climate impact. And if you're displacing diesel generators, you're displacing 1,500 grams of CO2. So purely from a climate perspective, if you're a corporate and you want to invest in renewable energy, you want to maximize the climate impact dollar for dollar, watt for watt, we need to be deploying more renewables, not in US states that already have a lot of renewables. We need to go where these new renewables can displace the dirtiest energy on the planet. And sadly, in many cases, that's in emerging markets where many people, many communities are stuck with some really dirty energy. So that's the opportunity. And I think what's been exciting is that reasoning, that logic makes a lot of sense to many companies. Sometimes because maybe they don't have direct operations in those markets, so they cannot use the renewable energy certificates under the GHG protocol for their scope 2 emissions, but they know that their supply chains touch those markets. They know that they have customers in those markets. Android phones are being used all over Africa, for example. So these are global companies with global footprints on the supply side in their supply chains, but also upstream or downstream where people are using their products. So the best companies, the climate leaders, are looking for climate impact, but also for climate justice. And that's been really exciting to see.
I don't want to end, of course, without giving you each the opportunity to bring anything up that you would want to make sure to say today that I didn't get the chance to ask you. Paul, you're still here, big on my screen. Is there anything that you want to mention today that we didn't get to talk about specifically?
Well, Ricky's mentioned the pilot opportunities. I think that's one way that companies and climate investors can get involved right now, and project developers too. So please reach out to us if you want to explore, as a corporate, if you want to explore how you can maximize your climate impact and accelerate the energy transition in developing countries. Talk to us. We've got some fantastic pilot projects in the pipeline. And also, we're working with a handful of companies now to craft a new corporate pledge where corporates will commit to playing their part in accelerating the energy transition globally. And we're doing this together with UN Energy and IFC and some other actors as well. So we'll reveal more about that as it comes together, but please contact us if that's something you might like to get involved in.
For those listening, please visit our website, which is d-rex.energy. We'll post some updates there as we continue to make some progress. There's also a way for us to get in touch with us. And I think we're really, going back to something I mentioned earlier, we're keen to engage with a variety of different stakeholders across the energy access ecosystem. So we're always looking for new information, new perspective. So please do drop us a line.
Guys, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today, and this format a shot for getting the message out there. I think it's one of the most exciting things that I've been involved in professionally. I am really encouraged to see where this goes. Your website is a great place to go to for information. South Pole has information up on their site. EnAccess has some of the materials up on our site. You can find things on GitHub. It's all over the internet, really. You just find one of these places and we're all linked up to each other. I'll make sure to put everything in the show notes and link everything up. For everyone who's listening today, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, like I said, there's so much else that we could talk about when it comes to this topic. So I would welcome your feedback. Let me know what you would like to what you would like more information on. What do we need to go deeper into? What kind of questions do you have? It's impossible to talk about this for 30 minutes and not be left thinking, I want to follow up on this, this, and this. So you can get in touch with me. I am reachable at tamara@enaccess.org. Again, this is all going to be listed in the show notes. And of course, if you have an idea for a project that needs to be funded that is open source, please go right ahead and submit your application today. You can take a look at our website, enaccess.org, to see the kinds of projects that we funded in the past. But don't take the projects that we funded in the past as a model, because we're up to fund anything that is going to bring big change, big ideas, and basically help accelerate global energy access. So the DREC initiative is a perfect example of that. Yeah, thanks again so much for listening, and go ahead and share this with a friend, and we'll be back in your podcast feeds again soon. Have a great day, Paul and Ricky. Thank you so much for joining me.